Good afternoon, everyone. And to those joining us on the West Coast, good morning. Thank you for joining this Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity webinar on a really important topic, child poverty, the trends and outlook. My name is Monique Garcia-Reiser, and I am a vice president at Friedman Consulting, where we collaborate with the Hatcher Group to bring nonpartisan stories, news, and convenings on poverty and opportunity. Our work at Spotlight aims to shine, yes, a light on the stories of people who live in poverty and are striving for opportunity, and the policies that help or at times hurt them. We strive to bring together varying points of view and find consensus on policies that can make a positive impact. And this year marks the 15th year that the Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity team has been doing this work. Over the past 2 years, as we all know, there have been an unprecedented investment in families and communities in the United States as we face the challenge of a generation, COVID-19 and its disparate impacts. One of those COVID-era policies is the widely debated and now halted expanded child tax credit. But there are many other policies over the past several decades that have aimed to reduce childhood poverty as well. And while we think we have consensus on the fact that we have reduced childhood poverty in America by a lot, what drove this decline and how current policies like this expanded child tax credit impact children in America still living in poverty is the question we're going to explore today. Reports like those released by Child Trends recently in September outlining this major decline and its drivers. And those reports and responses from the rest of our panelists who are here today include a lot of rich data and analysis. We have some really smart folks here today who could share a lot of data. And for some of us, like including me, this information can be a little bit dizzying. We need to make sense of it. So today is both about that data and also the children who are behind those numbers. Today is about how we can, as one of the wealthiest nations in the world, ensure our children get today is about how our children can get a chance to live a life free of poverty and lower the chances that they'll feel the pernicious impacts of poverty as well. So before I turn this over to our moderator, we want to thank the sponsors who made this conversation possible, the Esther A. and Joseph Klingenstein Fund and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. We really appreciate their support for having this important conversation today. As we get started on the program, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and our moderator will field those questions for the panelists later in the program. And now I am so pleased to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Senior Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, Aparna Mathur.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you so much to everyone for being here and for inviting me to moderate this very interesting discussion. Welcome to the Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity webinar, where we will discuss the recent report from Child Trends on the notable decline in child poverty over the last nearly 3 decades, and also discuss other policies that we believe can support families in need. My name is Aparna Mathur, and I'm a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government, where I also research social safety net issues. One of the most remarkable findings from the Child Trends report is the decline in child poverty between 1993 and 2019 of about 59%. This is using the supplemental poverty measure, which takes into account government's social safety net programs. While the report stops in 2019, if we actually look at Census Bureau data for 2020 and 2021, we actually see a pretty significant decline in child poverty using those numbers as well of about 46%. And this is primarily due to the large pandemic safety net programs that Monique alluded to, such as the expanded child tax credit and the others, the economic impact payments and the food stamps program, SNAP. So we are first going to get into the details of the Child Trends study. and the factors that might have contributed to this decline in child poverty, which have been a matter of some debate. One key takeaway is that there seems to be little or no disagreement on the actual trends themselves, which several researchers have documented. However, there is debate about what caused that decline, and that's what we're going to get into in this panel. The reason we care about child poverty is in many ways obvious. It often leads to situations of undernourishment, lack of a stable home environment, lack of good schooling, and then in the long run, worse lifetime outcomes in terms of academic achievement and access to economic opportunities. So addressing child poverty is a critical economic and social issue, but what is the best way to do that? To help answer this question, we have an outstanding panel with us today. So let me invite them to come on screen. I'm going to start with Dana Thomson. Dana Thomson is a developmental psychologist who studies the impact of poverty on child development, policies and practices that create more equitable access to economic mobility, and conditions that support child and family well-being. She co-leads Child Trends' work on child poverty, has led a series of studies on racial and ethnic disparities in access to a range of income support programs, and has provided training and technical assistance on supporting family economic mobility for early childhood education and care providers. Welcome, Dana. Next is Scott Winship. Scott, if you could come on screen. Scott is a senior fellow and the director of poverty studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he researches social mobility and the causes and effects of poverty. He also focuses on economic insecurity and inequality, among other poverty issues. Welcome, Scott. Sam Hammond is the director of social policy at the Niskanen Center. His research focuses on the effectiveness of cash transfers in alleviating poverty and how free markets can be complemented by robust systems of social insurance. Welcome, Sam. And last but not least, we have Stephen Nunez, who leads the Jain Family Institute's work on guaranteed income policy, testing its practical applications and design by taking on empirical work to understand how the design of these programs impacts individuals and communities. So thank you all for joining us. And we will begin by allowing each of the panelists to offer some opening remarks before we deep dive into the report. Each of our panelists has done a wealth of work on poverty and support programs. So let me ask each of you to talk a little bit about why you have focused your research on these areas and what are some of the key milestones you hope to see or the challenges you anticipate in the next few years. Dana, if I could start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aparna. And it is great to be here with all of you today. As Aparna mentioned, I am a developmental psychologist, so I bring a developmental child-focused approach to my work on poverty at Child Trends. And for those of you who are not familiar with Child Trends, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that conducts research on a wide range of issues that affect children's lives and healthy development. My own work examines the influence of anti-poverty policies and programs on child and family well-being and identifies barriers to accessing effective policies and programs. And I thought I'd start by offering 3 observations based on my and Child Trends research that I think will help to ground our conversation. The first is that child poverty is not the intractable problem we once thought it to be. This does not at all mean that our nation's work to protect children from poverty is over. It means that we've learned a lot about what works to reduce child poverty. And in particular, we've learned that public policies are really, really powerful tools that can directly impact the lives of children. The second observation I'd like to make is that making work for all families is actually a critical part of the solution to child poverty. So a healthy economy and the availability of work are necessary and important, but parental employment alone is not sufficient to lift families out of poverty today. Part of the solution must be ensuring that work can actually provide families with the resources they need to support their children. And we can make this happen through things like higher minimum wages to help families pay the bills and provisions like accessible childcare to support stable labor market participation. And my last observation is that a strong social safety net is the other critical component of the solution to child poverty. So during economic downturns and when work is not available or not sufficient to pay the bills, we need a safety net that ensures that all children, irrespective of race, ethnicity, or family structure, have something to rely on in times of need. And this requires a suite of programs that together address the very different types of circumstances that families face. So we need both cash-based programs and in-kind supports. We need programs that encourage work and programs that support children whose families are out of work or face significant barriers to work. And above all, we need programs that are designed with child well-being in mind and are accessible to the children who need them.
Thank you, Dana. I'm going to turn over to Scott.
Thanks, Aparna. I'm Scott Winship. I'm Director of Poverty Studies and Senior Fellow here at AEI. Have been interested in poverty for a long time, going back to college. As my views have evolved over the years, that has remained constant. I have a lot of overlap, I think, with what Dana just said. I'll also just make 3 points. I think the first is we should all want to reduce child poverty further. I think we all agree that it is at a historic low, but that doesn't mean we should stop there or be satisfied with that. I also want to note that the consensus that child poverty is at an all-time low isn't a new thing. In 2016, I released a report when I was at the Manhattan Institute, finding that the child poverty was already at an all-time low by 2013. You might want to dismiss that as my being conservative. If so, I would direct you to a 2017 report by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which said the child poverty rate fell to a record low of 15.6% in 2016. It went on to say the robust progress against child poverty is largely an unheralded development. So is the role of government progress in driving this government programs in driving this progress. But the second point I make is then as now, the issue is a lot more complicated than just focusing on government programs. So the Child Trends report that was just released found that child poverty fell by 16.5 percentage points from 1993 to 2019. They report that 6 percentage points was due to greater safety net spending. That leaves 10.5 points that's due to greater private income and lower taxes. Completely apart from the refundable tax credits that folks rightly like to credit with reducing poverty. So economic growth, strength of the labor markets, and rising work rates are a big part of the story. When I focused on the amount of focusing on the amount of income that safety net programs are providing also oversimplifies the importance of the safety net. We can't just look at how generous the safety net is. Other aspects of it are important too. Spending on cash welfare for single parent families fell over the period that Child Trends is looking at. Yet when I looked at the 1989 to 2019 increase in the family income of single mothers who were in the bottom third of the education distribution, their incomes rose by 71%. And all of that was due to a rise in private income. The cash income fell while income from other programs increased. But if you don't focus on the increase in private income, you miss a big part of the story. The last point I'll make is that we missed the policy lessons of the past 25 years if we just focus on the generosity of the safety net. Welfare reform in 1996, which was preceded by state reforms, encouraged greater work. That in turn increased earnings, which also increased the earned income tax credit benefits that people got because those went to working families, the child tax credit benefits that people got, and increased the unemployment benefits that people got when they lost their job because they had a work history now. And welfare reform may have also increased cohabitation. So in assessing policies to reduce child poverty, we have to keep in mind incentives around work and marriage. I think we're going to talk a lot about the child tax credit expansion from last year. There's great estimates out there that suggest that over the long run, that expansion would have reduced employment by 1.5 million people, mostly single parents. So it's a real mistake if we ignore those sorts of incentives and unintended consequences. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. Sam?
Thank you, Aparna, and thank you for having me. It is true that we have seen a a secular decline in child poverty. And I think it's really important that we celebrate that while still being focused on all the work that remains to be done. One of the immediate things that come to mind is, as a Canadian, I like to make cross-national comparisons, and I think it's really useful to have an international perspective when you make these evaluations of our success to date. And there's different ways of measuring poverty. The United States has a very, I would say, Baroque way of defining poverty that is very different from the rest of the world. And it is true that poverty has declined by those measures. But when you look at OECD statistics, across the OECD, the standard way of measuring poverty is what's called a relative measure of poverty, where they define it as 50% of the median income of that nation. And there, if you take a look, by those terms, we still have seen a decline in child poverty, but it's still above 20%. Now, there are lots of ways of critiquing relative poverty measures, of course, doesn't capture absolute deprivation. But you look at a country like Denmark, by that same metric, their child poverty is below 5%. And Denmark is obviously a very wealthy country, just like the United States. So that suggests there's still a lot of work to be done. And bridging a little bit with Scott's points, I think there are two concepts people refer to when they refer to poverty, and they're actually quite different. On the one hand, there's market income. There's being poor at any given point in time. When I was in grad school, I had very little income, and in some surveys, I would have been counted as poor, even though I was obviously, graduating with a degree that would earn me a market income at some point. And the same is true among many families of children. The two periods in your life when you're at most vulnerable and have the most need for income security are in your later years, when you're retired and living off savings, and in your younger years when you're having kids and all the expenses that come with that, normally before you've reached your peak earning potential. And so one of the roles of social insurance is really to spread that income across the life cycle. So when you're old, you're able to afford nursing homes and care and all the expenses related to end of life. And when you're young, you're able to have kids, even though you might be in your 20s and you're not expecting to earn six figures until your 40s. So that's the first thing. And that refers to, again, that sort of purely technical form of poverty of not having income when you have costs. And there's this other concept of poverty that people often conflate, which is sort of intergenerational or multi-generational poverty. Folks who are trapped in some form or another, either in particular social networks, neighborhoods, have a career ceiling, or face discrimination in many cases. And it's really important not to conflict those two, because to Scott's point, the way you address those two forms of poverty may be quite different. And I'm interested in addressing them both, and ideally both simultaneously. So one of the reasons I've been a champion of the child tax credit for many years is both because I think it can help reallocate resources to families who are in need of income support in the early years of their child's life, but then also by building a more common, more universalistic approach to supporting families, you can break down some of the barriers and some of the kind of web of poverty programs that families can get trapped into, and enter poverty in that richer sense of the term, where they're sort of becomes ensconced in a bureaucratic network that they build sort of expertise in and understanding in, and it becomes very difficult to break out of. And so that's why I think it's important both to focus on the cash element, but then also to be very sensitive to what kind of incentives or disincentives we're creating in these programs, both to work, but also to marriage. There are large marriage penalties and programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which do a great job of allocating resources to people below the poverty line, but risk entrenching multi-generational poverty if they discourage household formation and stable two-parent families. But then also marginal tax rates. When welfare reform was completed in the late 90s, it did a great job of eliminating a particular poverty trap in a particular program. But in some cases, if you zoom out, what it appears that we've done is really shift those effective marginal tax rates up the income scale a little bit. And so now you may be working class, you may have a job, but if you earn above $30,000 or so, suddenly you start to see benefits clawed back. And I think we can walk and chew gum in this case. We're both focusing on the market side, the income side of poverty, but also trying to address these structural issues as well. And one of the things I love about the child tax credit is, I think, done right, you can do both at the same time.
Thank you, Sam. You've already, spurred a question from the audience, which I will hold off on till we reach the Q&A portion of this discussion. So thank you, Sam. I'm going to turn over to Stephen.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. I'm not sure that everyone knows what the Jain Family Institute is, so I'll let you know. It is an applied research organization. We're headquartered in New York City. And we do, policy design and policy analysis, but we also do empirical research to try to understand, as you noted, how, I guess, the details of implementation and the details of distribution matter for these sorts of policies. Now, guaranteed income is unconditional cash transfers. So I think you can guess at perhaps where I would have areas of agreement and disagreement with my fellow panelists. And I think, I guess I would want to keep it short and, say that I think that the Child Trends team did a really kind of heroic job in looking at a very complex issue and tracking it over time. I think they were very open about the limitations of the data sources that they had access to, both in terms of things like underreporting of benefits, limited uptake of benefits, and so forth. And I think for anybody who's followed this debate over the years, there's just a constant battle about, how much did the economy matter, how much of this was because of the ITC specifically, and so forth. And I think we can get into relative contribution debates. But I do want to sort of think about the bigger picture thing, and I don't think this is going to be surprising, again, given where I'm at, which is that in the 90s, with the expansion of the EITC, making it a much more central part of our anti-poverty focus, and with the removal of the AFDC, we shifted our safety net, towards much more heavily work-conditioned programs. And I think, when you do that, when you have a largely work-conditioned safety net, then almost by definition, right, the amount of poverty that we have and the amount of child poverty that we have is going to become much more heavily the result of economic growth and the state of the economy at the time, where we are in a business cycle. And I think you can argue about, how much of that is, the economy specifically, or how much of that is the programs. But I think the broader point is, I'm not as interested in the relative contributions as I am in the absolute level of child poverty. And I think when you make that choice, you end up with a system where poverty is both higher than it has to be, and far more volatile because it is so heavily dependent on the business cycle than it needs to be. So, and you see that in the data. You see that when, something like the Great Recession comes along and work-conditioned programs fail to provide the safety net, and poverty increases. And you see that when, economic growth picks up, things are going well. And then when economic growth is sluggish, then progress is sluggish. And I think, even seeding the reality that the EITC may be effective on some level in increasing earnings. And we can also talk about Sam's very good point about things like marginal tax rates in terms of like the phase out of EITC and so forth. I think even seeding that, it's very clear, even from probably the most hostile simulations that were in response to the CTC expansion over the last couple of years, that even if you seed that point and take the strictest incentive structure assumptions, you still reduce child poverty by a whole lot more if you give people unconditional cash. And I think Sam's point again about intergenerational transfer of poverty, and Dana's point about what we know about alleviating poverty and what impact that can have on the adult sort of outcomes of children who are lifted out of poverty at a sort of a crucial point, suggests that unconditional cash, from my perspective, needs to be a part of this discussion. But I think, like everybody else, I recognize that a strong labor market with full employment is also part of it, and that cash can't be the be all end all as much as we are very market focused, and giving cash empowers people to participate in markets, good old fashioned American capitalism. There's some things that markets don't necessarily do well, and there needs to be more to the story than that. So I think I'll stop at that point and let you get on to the
Thank you, Steve. And I think we've gotten a nice preview of what's coming up from all these opening statements. I'm just going to turn over to Dana because I'm not sure how many people have actually read the Child Trends report in detail. So if you could give us, Dana, a quick overview of your main findings, and especially this point that has come up, I think in all of the opening statements about, the role that macroeconomic conditions have played in alleviating poverty versus the safety net. How did we come up with those findings? And then I'm going to turn to the panelists to react to your analysis of the report and especially to this piece of it. So I'm just going to turn over to you, and if you could give us the big key takeaways.
Sure, and I'll try and be brief. Our recent report investigated the economic, demographic, and policy forces that led to this nearly 60% reduction in child poverty over the last quarter century. As you said, I think we went from 1993 to 2019 specifically because we were interested in looking at the role of the more permanent safety net, and saw the more recent years as fairly different, extraordinary. We found that the social safety net and healthy economic conditions work together to reduce child poverty. So specifically, we found lower unemployment rates, more single moms entering the labor force, higher state minimum wages, and increased spending across a wide range of safety net programs, all contributed to this decline. And I do want to just make a quick note about a point Steve made in terms of kind of comparing the relative contributions. I want to be very transparent and say that our methods did not allow us to examine the relative contribution of economics and the social safety net directly. So, but they are both clearly playing a very important role here. We did also look at demographic factors. I would say demographic factors as a whole did not really play much of a role in the decline, but I will note a few things. We did see that increases in the share of children in two-parent families were associated with declines in child poverty, but across this time period as a whole, the share of children in two-parent families didn't actually change all that much, so it wasn't really contributing to the decline. We also found that increases in the share of children whose families face discrimination or occupational segregation, so for example, Hispanic and immigrant families, were associated with increases in child poverty rates. So these are demographic factors that are putting upward pressure on child poverty rates, meaning that if it weren't for the systemic barriers that increasing shares of our population are experiencing, child poverty would have declined even more. And an additional demographic factor is that we looked at was teen birth rates. There was a huge decline in teen birth rates over this time period, about, I think it dropped 72%. And we didn't find that decline in teen birth rates was associated with the decline in poverty, but we did find that it was associated with declines in child deep poverty, and in a pretty big way. It was associated with about 50% of the decline in child deep poverty. And I will just finish up by saying that there is certainly a lot to celebrate here. I think it's important for us to pause and recognize the success. We saw declines in child poverty across all 50 states and DC, across nearly all subgroups of children we examined. But there are some important caveats that we highlighted in the report as well. One was the growth in the social safety net over the last quarter century has been mainly aimed at children and families just below the poverty threshold. And we've actually made little progress as a country in strengthening the safety net for children experiencing deep poverty. And another caveat is that we see huge disparities in which children are most at risk of experiencing poverty. And these disparities, even though we've seen declines across all groups, the disparities themselves have not budged. So Black and Hispanic children and children in immigrant, children in single parent families remain 3 times as likely as their peers to experience poverty, and children in immigrant families remain 1.7 times as likely as their peers to experience poverty. So those are the big findings from the report, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dana. I had a quick follow-up on that. So in reading through the report, I think like you mentioned, you find that state unemployment rates matter for poverty reduction, but there's a limited role for GDP and median wage growth increases. And I'm just curious because typically you would see, low state unemployment rates highly correlated with GDP and median wage increases. So are we really certain that these factors are not playing a role, or is it just that we're not able to identify the role that these macroeconomic factors are playing? So you're not saying that you're ruling out that better economic conditions matter for poverty reduction. You're just saying we're not able to identify it in the analysis we have done.
So we did include median wages and GDP per capita in our models. We did see growth over this time period that we studied in both of those factors. We also found that they were associated with increases in low income, rates of low income. So those factors, I believe, are probably playing a role for families at higher income levels. We did not find that they were associated with declines in child poverty.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn over to Scott. Scott, I think you raised the point in one of your opinion articles that GDP growth has reduced poverty a lot more, maybe than the safety net, or like it has a bigger contribution or a relatively bigger contribution than the report finds. So one quick, any response to that? And secondly, in comparing which factors matter more, like isn't the role of the safety net actually far more critical when economic conditions are bad, right? Like if you're talking about what matters for child poverty, it's great when the economy is doing well and everyone's better off. But don't we think that the safety net is precisely designed to ramp up at times of economic downturn? And so why wouldn't we expect it to sort of play a really big role, in the time period that we're looking at, where we've been through not just like we've been through the Great Recession, and then the early 2000s. So just any response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one important thing to point out for folks who aren't as in the weeds on some of this stuff as we are, is that the official poverty measure, is really a terrible guide to what's happened to poverty over time. And that's something that is not an ideological or partisan point. The best measures of poverty out there show very different trends than the official poverty measure. And what those best measures show, interestingly, I think, is contrary to what Stephen said, during recent downturns, poverty actually has not gone up all that much. And that is a credit to the safety net for sure. But if you compare the increase in poverty or child poverty for the recession that happened in 1975, the recessions of the early 1980s, the recession of the early 1990s, poverty rose much more during those recessions, which were before welfare reform, than they did in the recessions we've had since. The 2001 recession, which was mild, the Great Recession, which was not mild, it was long. one of the longer ones we've ever experienced. And then the brief one of 2020, which wasn't that long, but was incredibly deep for a couple of months. And in each case, policymakers acted to temporarily expand the safety net in response to hardship, and it's really done a great job at sort of serving this counter-cyclical role of making sure that during downtimes we don't see spikes in poverty. I do think, lots of times you sort of getting back to the point about how important the economy or work was. There is this tendency for a lot of folks who are opposed to welfare reform to say, well, employment went up among single mothers, but that was really just because the 1990s economy was booming, and that really should get the credit. It wasn't welfare reform; it was the 1990s economy. The problem with that is that employment rates among single mothers, for instance, went up from around 60% in 1993 to about 70% in 2000, and then they never got as low as 60% again. In 2011, the sort of new low was 63%, which was still higher than it ever was before. In 2019, it was still 70% employment rates for single mothers. So we've increased work, and that increased earnings and benefits that are tied to work. And we haven't had the big increases in poverty during recessions that we saw before welfare reform. So I think we've actually hit on sort of the magic formula for our safety net writ large, and so departures from that formula really scare me.
Thank you, Scott. Stephen, and I'll react to Scott.
Well, I will say that the Child Trends team did, in fact, note that the EITC had an impact on the employment rate of single mothers, and that it was. But this is a very complicated debate. I'll also note that we did a great job in the last recession in making sure that poverty didn't drop, in part by removing the work conditioning from our safety net. And I would also note that although everybody falling at once during the economy is quite notable and quite obvious in something like a Great Recession or the pandemic recession, I'm not sure what we call it, people are constantly losing their jobs or falling ill or having to take care of somebody who's ill and not being able to tap into that. And, they don't get a temporary suspension of those work requirements. Again, what I see here is that we have a work condition safety net, and a lot of what Dana has mentioned, if you can't work, poverty is stubborn. If you are an undocumented immigrant and you can't work, poverty is stubborn. I don't want to get into whether or not undocumented immigrant families should be receiving benefits, but I think that the point is, to the extent that you are able to work, there is safety net provision, and you see that with what she mentioned and what others have mentioned, which is that a lot of the money that we have goes to people who are, say, just below the poverty line, and it does a good job of, in many instances, and because they're the working poor, and it does a good job of bringing them perhaps just above the poverty line. You would expect that something like deep poverty would be more stubborn if work is really a requirement in order to get benefits. But yeah, I think, like I said, I think we could do better. The sort of the famous thing that I mentioned, the Corinth and Meyer paper says, if you take away the phase-in, the trapezoidal sort of aspect of the CTC, then a bunch of people, will stop working. And the people laughed at the strength of that impact, and people like Bastian and Hilary Hoynes and others said, well, actually, we don't think that's a great estimate. Here's a different estimate. But even in that Meyer paper, poverty drops, even including the sort of the work disincentive effect of no longer having that. Even if you buy into that very extreme, you can reduce poverty. And considering how much damage poverty does to children, it just seems to me like a no-brainer that we'd want to find the most effective way to do it. And the one that is, and I'm sure we're going to get into this at some point, least administratively burdensome. The idea of unconditional cash is don't make people jump through hoops to get aid. Don't, don't, I guess, accept a system that requires all sorts of eligibility requirements and paperwork, because what you end up with is, if you're thinking the type 1 versus type 2 error, you got people who are eligible on paper not receiving those benefits. And you also, frankly, have people who, in order to get those benefits, have to rely on things like paid tax prep or so forth, which ends up cutting the net transfer. So I think, and I bet you we all agree on this, that we could find ways to make the administration of these benefits far more automatic and less burdensome.
Thank you, Stephen. Sam?
Yeah, again, I think it's useful to pull out a bit and look at the international evidence on the question. Since I've been in DC, I sometimes get the feeling that if it wasn't a pilot program in Wisconsin in the early 90s, it never happened, right? And there's a lot of evidence we can draw on for this debate. So, absent the 6-month period when the U.S. had a monthly child tax credit in 2021, the U.S. is one of the outliers in the world. There's 108 countries worldwide that have a periodic child benefit of some form or another. That's a huge evidence base to draw upon, and obviously those countries will have a lot of differences in how their labor markets are structured, what other benefits they provide. But if you look at a country like Canada, for instance, which, Anglo-American country, very liberal labor market policies, if anything, probably bigger swings and exposure to macroeconomic ups and downs. Their female labor force participation rate and employment rate are fully 5 or 6 percentage points higher than the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I've never really seen a great explanation for why. In terms of social policy, the two big differences that jump out to me are A, Canada has universal access to healthcare, and B, they have a robust unconditional child benefit. And indeed, when the child benefit was introduced, it replaced an in-work tax credit with something more universal, and single female parent labor force participation increased a percentage point. Healthcare is another interesting one. I've seen arguments, including published by Chicago's Becker Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago. Casey Mulligan has even made the argument that employer-based healthcare is a good institution to have because it functions as a work incentive. Because if you want, if you're on the sidelines and you want health insurance, you have to work to get it, and that just seems a little bit backwards to me. Obviously, having some basic needs met, having cash in the form of a child benefit to go out and afford a nanny or babysitter so you can go hand out resumes, having basic access to health services so you can be healthy to work in the first place. Those to me seem like they, if anything, would induce greater labor force participation by dint of their universal accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
Pulling back out, the Atlanta Fed this year released a really great tool for understanding effective marginal tax rates in the U.S. fiscal system. And what they show is that, while it's true we've made strides in reducing work disincentives at the bottom end, like as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we've kind of shifted them up the income scale. So now, just above the federal poverty line, if you're a single parent with 2 kids, and let's say you're on Medicaid, SNAP, and receive the ITC, above about $20,000 in income, you face effective marginal tax rates of as high as 90%, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we may have solved poverty, but really what we've done is, going back to my distinction between income poverty and intergenerational poverty, we've still entrenched a kind of near poor population, and count that as a win. And I think that's something that we really want to look at carefully at and try to avoid. And where cash can enter in this, one of the reasons why child benefits I don't think should be connected to work is both because of that problem, but then also, income support is needed precisely when you face a job disruption.
Yeah.
When the Quarterly Journal of Economics looked at this earlier this year as well, they used the January 1st cutoff for the earned income tax credit to look at the effect of babies born just before or after the cutoff, and it was kind of shocking to me because those babies that were eligible just by dint of 1 or 2 days of their due date, went on. They on average they received about $1,300 more than the other babies, but they followed up using longitudinal data and found that those kids had higher graduation rates, higher earnings. We celebrate anytime like an intervention doesn't fade out after 2 years in the child development space, and simply having cash, and they ascribe it to what they call a liquidity effect, just the fact that around childbirth you're very cash strapped and don't have a lot of cash on hand. Solving that liquidity problem requires that these benefits not be, at least in toto, bound up with active participation in the labor market.
Thank you. I'm going to tie in 2 threads. And one, I think we've all been talking about the 96 welfare reform. And I noticed in Dana's report, you basically say, well, TANF or the switch from AFDC to TANF really didn't do anything to reduce child poverty. And I think, others on the panel would say, well, that shifted people towards work. And so that's why we see the reduction in child poverty. So I want each of you to comment on that. And the second thread that I think has come out through this conversation is our safety net shifting more towards people who have a job? Are we helping people more who already have work, rather than, what I would think of as the role of the safety net, which is protecting people precisely when they lose their jobs or they're going through, a situation that leaves them vulnerable. And so, how do we think about that switch? Are we comfortable with that switch towards a more work-based safety net? And what happens to people who are not able to participate in that? And people have written that about the EITC as well. The EITC is great at encouraging work and incentivizing people. I know there's been some research that suggests that maybe it didn't have the large effect that we traditionally thought it did. But at the same time, it's only available to people who actually do work. So 2 quick questions. One, what do we think was the role of the 96 welfare reform in reducing child poverty? And secondly, how do we think about this change from, work being, like the safety net being more work focused than it had been traditionally? I'll start with Scott.
Great, thanks. So I've sort of said before, I think welfare reform was important in reducing child poverty. The employment trends for single mothers were much greater than the increase in employment among married mothers. Single childless women, actually, over this period, their employment rates fell. So I think welfare reform pretty clearly increased work. I think there have been a number of studies, including from the Brookings papers on economic activity in 2004, the Council of Economic Advisors a couple of times in the 1990s, several other papers that have tried to very sophisticated way estimate what the impact was between the improving economy in the 90s, the expansion of the earned income tax credit, and welfare reform. All 3 were important for sure, but they all consistently show that welfare reform was a big deal. A couple other things I want to say, regarding deep poverty. Again, our poverty numbers are problematic. One way that they're problematic is that they undercount a lot of income. So Bruce Meyer and Kevin Corinth have been using administrative data from the IRS, from Social Security Administration, from various government agencies to correct estimates for underreporting of benefits and of earnings. And they have a paper from March of this year where they show that actually deep poverty has also declined since 1995. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the extent to which there is this group at the bottom that has been hurt or unaffected by welfare reform. Deep poverty is very hard to measure in our data that's not from administrative sources. And then one last thing I'd say, just because I think Stephen sort of mocked it a bit, the study by Kevin Corinth and Bruce Meyer from 2021 about arguing that 1.5 million people would stop working if the expanded child tax credit were made permanent. There's a lot of sort of misdirection that is hurled at that paper, but at the end of 2021, they actually did an analysis where they took an estimate of the sensitivity of employment to changes in the return to work that are found in the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit has a phase-in. The expanded CTC would have taken away the phase-in from the CTC. And so whatever impact you think that the EITC has in promoting work, taking away that same phase-in from the EITC would have the opposite effect. So they take an estimate of that that is cited in the National Academy of Sciences report that was produced on reducing child poverty from Hilary Hoynes, one of the critics of the Corinth and Meyer paper. They applied that to the change in the return to work among single mothers in moving from the old CTC to an expanded CTC. This was an uncontroversial estimate. Nobody ever sort of expressed any doubt about that. And they also added in an income effect, the fact that people, when they get more income, often choose to spend some of it by enjoying more leisure and working less. Also an uncontroversial estimate that nobody in this debate argued about. When they did that, they came up with an estimate of 1.3 million. And that was just for single mothers. Their original paper of 1.5 million included married couples as well. So in short, using the very estimates from some of his own harshest critics, Meyer and Corinth showed that if you think the EITC has increased work, the CTC expansion would have reduced it. Sam's talking a lot about the impact of marginal tax rates during the phase out when people move from a lower income to a higher income and therefore lose benefits, and that reduces work incentives reduces marriage incentives. If you believe those incentives are important, you have to believe the incentives on the other side are important too. And so I just don't think there's any getting around that paper.
Thank you. I'm going to ask everyone to take just a minute to respond before we turn to questions. Dana?
Sure. So I do want to point out that our report did not specifically look at the behavioral impacts of welfare reform. But to answer your question and to Scott's point, there is a lot of research out there that has looked at those effects. As Scott said, there are kind of 3 different factors that are looked at. One is we've seen during this time period work requirements and time limits. During the same time period, unrelated to welfare reform, we see a much tighter labor market, and then we also see a huge expansion of the earned income tax credit. And studies that have looked across those 3 different things in conjunction with other factors have found that the EITC does play the expansion of the EITC in particular plays a pretty big role in increasing single mother labor force participation during that time period. So I do want to acknowledge there are behavioral effects that do occur when we're talking about policies. When we looked at TANF in our study, we were looking specifically at its poverty reduction role. So we saw it decrease really significantly over the time from 1993 to 2019. So I think it went from being actually the biggest program protecting children from both poverty and deep poverty to being the smallest program. So by, I can't remember the exact numbers, but by 2019, it was playing a very minimal role in terms of protecting children from poverty. Also, I'll just say to Scott's point about incentives and disincentives, I do think that incentives work very different. Work incentives work very differently than work disincentives. And I'm happy to follow up on that. But I think what's pretty critical for moving forward for our social safety net and for reducing child poverty as a whole is that we actually have a mix of programs. So as Scott and others have mentioned, Steve mentioned as well, we actually saw during big periods of economic recession, poverty remain relatively stable or even decrease a little bit when we would have expected it to go up. And that was very unexpected. I think folks in the 1990s, when they were seeing what was happening in terms of these changes in the policies, expected that when people lost jobs, they would also lose their access to social safety net programs. And we didn't see that happen. And part of the reason we didn't is that some of those programs aren't conditional on work, and they actually are designed to expand very naturally when we have recessions. And the other reason, which I think is important to call out, is that a lot of the government aid during those recessions were temporary programs. And so when we remove those programs, we are also seeing a decrease in the role of the social safety net.
Thank you. Sam and Stephen, very quickly.
I'll try to be quick. First, Stephen did allude to Jacob Bastian's work on this question, and Jacob had a paper, I think almost 2 years ago now, where he tried to replicate the Becker-Friedman Institute study to the best of his ability. It's a bit of a black box, but the number he came up with was not 1.5 million, but 400,000, which is still a reduction in labor supply, but it's like a bad jobs report on that order of magnitude. Even then, I'm still a little bit skeptical of those results because there's a kind of game that gets played in economic modeling, and as an economist, I can sort of speak to this, where everything is driven by your modeling assumptions. It's garbage in, garbage out, and you look at in that paper you dig into their methodology. It's we did a meta-analysis, or we cite a meta-analysis of all the studies of the EITC that have been done to date, and we present the range of their estimates for elasticities, and that ranges from 0.3 to 1.2, and the bigger that number, the bigger the labor market impact you're going to see from a removal of those incentives. And so they say, well, from 0.3 to 1.2, we'll just take the midpoint and say 0.75, and that's, I think, very, very disingenuous, to be frank. The studies that they're pooling from include very different populations and can't really be generalized both through space or time, right? More up-to-date estimates suggest that the 0.3 is probably much closer to where we are today, and reflective of probably what the typical across all household elasticities are. The other thing to keep in mind is if you look at just a simple line chart of single parent employment over time, there is a kind of step function increase during the welfare reform debate. During welfare reform, and we can debate whether the labor market, the work requirements, all that. Taking that as it is, that's a one-time increase, a pretty remarkable increase. Several million women pulled into the labor force, whatever mix of influences you want to ascribe to it. Those are sort of once in a generation changes in the labor market. And the people that you've pulled into the labor force are probably also the ones who are most sensitive to those kinds of incentives. And so now you have to update to the new population, which on average are not going to be people who are sitting on the sidelines and on the dole waiting for any incentive to pull them into the labor market. They're going to be people who are out of the labor force because they're caring for a family member, or for a variety of other reasons other than because we're paying them to be out of the labor force.
Okay, thank you. And Stephen, 30 seconds. I'm so sorry, but I'll give you the next.
I'll say that what Sam mentioned is great because Jack Landry, one of our associates, did a paper kind of digging into the weeds of the elasticity assumptions also, and found some very similar things. I'll say though that the Corinth and the Meyer paper, even they themselves say, if taking our assumptions, child poverty drops by 20%. If you do this, job losses is an all. So it's really a question of your priorities and what kind of system you want to see. I'll also just say that TANF is increasingly not playing a role in poverty because the block grant has allowed states to take the cash that goes into TANF and move it directly into their state EITC program. So almost by definition, the state EITC is going to start playing a bigger role. At the same time, it's sort of focused at, it's stuck at about $20 billion a year, non-inflation adjusted. So just over time, naturally, even the cash support that it provides is going to drop without state intervention. And not every state, like a California or New York, is doing that. I don't have more time to respond, but I'll move on to the next question.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen. So we have our first question, which is, when we talk about a reduction in child poverty, we never mention the outdated methodology used to determine the poverty level, even though there seems to be universal agreement that the threshold is too low. How relevant is a reduction when the measure itself is not an accurate reflection of what families are experiencing? Sam or Stephen, do you want to take that? Because I remember Sam talking about the broken way of defining poverty.
I'll start. I mean, just as a start, I'll notice that, and maybe people are in the weeds, but the federal poverty line, that official measure, I think, is in fact, everybody considers it to be inadequate and not a great way of looking at it, which is why we all typically use the supplemental poverty measure, which actually does think about, cost of living and so forth. And that's what's being used in this analysis. I also do think that it is worth pointing out that, poverty is a dichotomous variable in the way that we're talking about it, right? So you could design a program, and to some extent, our safety net is built this way, which takes people from just below the poverty line and just above above the poverty line. That looks great, but it doesn't necessarily mean that material hardship, that material conditions have really changed that much. I think. In a thread that Dana and I were on a few months ago, somebody else had come on and said, what we really want is this sounds dramatic, but human flourishing. And I think, a safety net that simply brings people $1 over the poverty line, something that's gamed in that way, is not necessarily what we want to go for. We want to go for something that helps people meet their needs and also allows the next generation of in that household to flourish, to go to school, to get a job, or start a business, or do whatever it is that they want to do. So I agree that it's quite possible that we all kind of get focused in on what is essentially an arbitrary measure and sort of lose sight of what the bigger picture is.
Thank you. Sam, did you want to add in?
There's sort of no fact of the matter about where you draw the line for poverty. The World Bank says $2 a day. Clearly, we're all well above that line. And so when it comes to poverty in rich or developed country contexts, I tend to prefer to use the OECD standard of 50% of median income. And that's because we're sort of admitting from the outset that relative poverty is the thing that matters. Because again, as I said, very few people in the United States are living on less than $2 a day. And the virtue of that is it allows for robust comparisons where you don't have to get into a lot of methodological disputes. And obviously it doesn't capture the whole picture, but the best case scenario is we just look at the entire income distribution. And then we can avoid the kind of tyranny of metrics that occurs when we're creating means-tested programs to shift people over an arbitrary line. If we looked at the entire distribution, we'd see the forest for the trees. And it would also help us let us separate the sort of income definition of poverty from the more sociological definition, which I think, going to Steve's point about this kind of vague quest for human flourishing, we can all recognize that a low-income neighborhood that has a high crime rate and a lot of blight and car break-ins and so forth, and poor public schools, we recognize that as an issue above and beyond knowing exactly where their incomes fall, and looking, and in that case you want a more sort of multimodal response, because just sending checks will not solve that problem.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the next question, which is similar, I think, to this. Is any panelist aware of the tool produced by United Way to measure economic hardship of families called ALICE, which is an acronym for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed, which determines minimum household survival budgets based on the age and composition of the household, localized at the county level throughout the US to parameters such as housing, transportation, healthcare, food, childcare, etc. This type of tool moves beyond the federal poverty line to take expenses into account, where FPL has fluctuated very minimally in the last 30 years. If you're basing policies on a flawed measurement tool, where is there room for a more accurate depiction of the experience of families across the US? Dana, Scott, do you want to take this?
Sure, I'll start. I am aware of that tool. It's a great tool. I would say that, I would agree with both Steve and Sam's points that our current poverty thresholds and measures tend to underestimate the cost of basic needs. And not only that, they're really not tapping into what is required for full participation in society or for thriving. They also tend to be, at this threshold where it's not clear that it's meaningful if you earn $100 less versus $100 more. But I will say that there is, there are a number of different measures out there. They answer different questions. Sam mentioned relative poverty measures, and those are particularly helpful for international comparisons. When you're asking a question and you're trying to disentangle the role of the economy versus the role of everything else, you want to measure that's actually that's going to separate out increases in standard of living. And so none of these measures are perfect. But they do play an important role, because it's through measures like this that we're able to look over time to see what we're doing right, and whether what direction poverty levels are headed in.
Thank you, Dana. Scott, I'll turn the next one over to you. Much of the reduction in child poverty over the last 2 decades is credited to the EITC. However, because we do not have data on EITC receipt and instead use simulations, that anti-poverty effect is overestimated. So see Jones and Ziliak 2019. Do you see that as a problem, both in your assessment of the state of poverty and the solutions to it?
Well, I'm thankful for that question. So again, I'm going to cite the work of Bruce Meyer, who has looked at this paper by Jones and Ziliak from 2022. And what Bruce Meyer finds is that if you correct not just the earned income tax credit amounts that are in the CPS for measurement error, but you also correct all of the other forms of income, safety net benefits and taxes for measurement error, again, using administrative data that generally we don't have access to, that conclusion completely reverses, that in fact the imputations of the EITC income in the CPS understate the poverty reduction effect of the earned income tax credit rather than overstating it. So if that's Matt Brunig in the questions, hi Matt. If it's not, Matt's just wrong on this. The other thing that I just can't let go, we're trying to talk about empirical questions here, and I just can't let what Sam said go by. Jacob Bastian did not try to replicate the Meyer and Corinth study. He used a different substitution effect, the key parameter that we're all fighting about. He used a different one, and that's why he got a different result. He didn't try to replicate it. And I also want to say the December 2021 study that I cited earlier was it makes all of the criticisms that Sam mentioned moot, because he's taking an estimate of the substitution effect from the very report where the report authors, the National Academy of Sciences report authors disagree with him. He's using their number, and which is just for single mothers. It's not for a broad range of populations, as Sam says, and he's getting the same result. I'm not sure, we're not served by researchers who repeatedly, after we've had multiple forums of discussing these issues, mischaracterize the results of research in that way.
Thank you, Scott.
I don't want to fight with him. I just want to say something.
Yeah.
There's there is the Meyer work on the, we're underestimating benefits from self-report on things like SNAP and so forth. There's also the issue of, people don't have 100% take up of EITC and so forth. My guess is that, it's probably a wash, but I don't want to get into that. What I do think we could do is think about how to make a benefit system that's much easier to access, right? You could, if we only have 80, 85%, 90%, but not 100% uptake, I think we can do better on something like the EITC by making tax filing far less burdensome, and by making it so that, right now we know that about 50% of the people who receive the EITC receive it after going to paid tax prep. So that means that we have a kind of a vulture class that's eating into the net transfer. And I don't think, regardless of how awesome the EITC currently is, it could be better, in part by thinking through these sort of administrative challenges and making it so that it's not such a pain in the butt for folks, especially those who have, the hardest time sort of navigating the system, get access to these benefits.
And I would say that's a perfect kind of segue into thinking about what areas of consensus we have and how we can move forward. I think especially as we're thinking about the expanded child tax credit, what are these foundational elements that are really important to include? And I think one of them is minimizing administrative burden. So in a number of the proposals out there, there's the details around who's administering the expanded child tax credit, and there's some suggestion of moving administration from IRS to the Social Security Administration, and that is a way of reducing administrative burden. It also means that families are not having to pay tax preparers in order to receive what's left of their benefits.
So I'm going to end on that question because we did get, what adjustments would you recommend to current workforce systems or to safety net programs so that we're not unduly penalizing children? And I can tie it into this whole debate around the administrative burden of, accessing different safety net programs, or, Stephen's point about, should we then just make it so easy for people to have access to cash? If everyone just wants to do like a quick summary of their key takeaway, where they see the world moving ahead on, how we deal with these different safety net programs, how do we make them easier to access, that would round up the panel beautifully. Thank you so much. Dana, since you're on my screen first, you did good.
Sure. I think, the first one, as I said, is reducing administrative burden. I will note also on that administrative burden does not tend to be proportionally across our population, that there are certainly some populations that experience more burden than others. So that's important not only for getting benefits in the hands of families that need them, but also in reducing some of the disparities in accessing these benefits. I would also say that, a key element of proposals of policies moving forward is ensuring that our country's poverty reductions programs are targeted to and reaching the children who are most vulnerable to the deleterious consequences of poverty. So, for every dollar we spend preventing child poverty in the first place, we would save over 7 times as much on the back end. And the children that are most vulnerable to the consequences of poverty are our youngest children who experience deep poverty, and children who experience prolonged poverty. So I think we need to increase supports for young children. There are some elements of that in some of the expanded child tax credit proposals, where there's more generous benefits for families with younger children. I think we need to increase supports for those who are experiencing deep poverty. So I'm a strong proponent of the child tax credit being fully refundable. I think the Tax Policy Center released an analysis of the child tax credit this year and found that 11 million households are below the threshold to get the full child tax credit, and that's more.
Thank you, Dana. I'm going to have to. Sorry.
Sure.
stop you there. I'll turn to Sam, and then Stephen, and then Scott.
Yeah, if I could just use this last minute to correct Scott on that point. It is true that Jacob does have his preferred specification in his study, but it was intended to be a replication study, and I can even quote from it where he says, by using the same labor supply elasticities, I am able to replicate the simulated effects of current et al. However, using their own elasticity assumptions, I find their claims of the CTC's effect on poverty are not accurate. So it is true that he does have his own preferred estimate, but this is not an empirical question, of course, because these are models, neoclassical models. The empirical literature on child benefits is crystal clear that it doesn't impact work. So and to the point of administrative burdens, I think is really a good place to end, because one of the, I think, core virtues of child benefits and programs like the child tax credit, especially as it was expanded in 2021, is how it removes the onus on the low income household for filing for the benefit, for claiming the benefit, for jumping through all these administrative hoops. Going to whatever you think about the actual impact of the earned income tax credit on poverty, for instance, we do know that a significant portion is captured by tax prep companies because it is quite complicated to file for, and if you don't do it right, you're always at risk of being audited.
Thank you. Stephen?
Sam picked up my point. You want to get rid of administrative burdens, and you want to target the folks who are most sort of currently burdened. The best way to do that is with an unconditional cash transfer program. But rather than beat a dead horse, I think I would also like to add something here, which is, there's other stuff that kind of fell off the radar over the last year. One thing that I think is extremely important is unemployment insurance reform. Meaning not just that we actually create a real standard in terms of the amount of the length of the aid that you receive. Some states have literally 13 weeks, most have 26, a much more robust replacement rate, but also something that I think is very common outside the United States, but doesn't exist in the United States, which is a job seekers allowance for people who are, for example, just had a child and have been out of the labor force for a while and are now going to re-enter the labor force. We don't provide aid to people who are entering the labor force or re-entering the labor force, like, for example, returning citizens or so forth. And I think that's another way to provide a bridge to people as they sort of establish themselves, and get the employment that I think we all agree is going to be part of combating poverty. And I would love to see some attention placed on that. I've seen folks come to me with it as part of the sort of the broader guaranteed income framework, but I think it's a distinct program, and I think it deserves I guess, analysis and discussion, in and of itself.
Scott.
I'll close on a point of a disagreement and agreement with Sam. The disagreement is that Sam has, again, I think, misled folks, intentionally or not, by citing research looking at the effect of giving people $300 a month in 2021 when it was scheduled to go away at the end of the year, versus the effect that everybody's interested in, which is the effect of giving people $300 a month every month in perpetuity. There has not been research on that. The best research on it is the research that's been done by Kevin Corinth and Bruce Meyer, which Sam hasn't rebutted except to mischaracterize the research. That said, I agree completely with Sam that we need to worry about intergenerational poverty. And I think that calls for a whole nother set of policies that, contrary to Stephen, are not about giving people cash. We've reduced the child poverty rate to historic lows. The intergenerational mobility rate over time has not improved at all. So we're going to need different kinds of policies related to early childhood education, related to K through 12, related to concentrated poverty, related to a whole other set of issues that are not simply about giving people money.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm going to turn over to Monique for closing remarks.
Thank you, Aparna. I was going to start my closing remarks by saying there's clearly a lot of agreement. And then, no, actually, that's actually, it is important to note that there is a lot of agreement across the ideological spectrum that we have succeeded in many ways, and there's more work to do. Spotlight is delighted to have brought this to the folks listening today. Thank you, Aparna, Sam, Stephen, Dana, and Scott for joining us. And also really want to thank the folks who made this possible, the Esther A. and Joseph Klingenstein Fund and the Doors to Charitable Foundation. Please sign up for our newsletter if you'd like to hear more conversation like this. We're going to continue to cover this really important issue. And thank you again all for participating in today. Have a great day.
Thank you.